Welcome. We're going to be looking at in this series of videos is we're going to be looking at basically skills that can help you interpret and understand complex texts. And we're going to go through basically a whole heap of research strategies, methods, and means of studying in order to be able to understand, to be able to interpret, and be able to go through texts to such an extent where you're able to construct your own independent analysis of them, and you're able to do so in such a way where you're able to construct your own argument out of them. Okay, so the ultimate goal out of this is to basically equip you with all the tools that you need in order to be able to write your own response based on the text that you are given. And whether that's an extended text or a short text, you should be able to utilize your skills of inquiry, of research, of basically any skill of asking questions and interpretation to be able to answer any sort of question or any sort of statement on a text and be able to do it with insight and depth. And that's what we're mainly looking at. Okay, so to start with, what we're going to look at is how to find answers, where you're going to get your answers from. Now, this is probably the hardest part for those who are starting with complex texts, is to find not only answers to complex questions and complex text, but also basically the interpretation process. So not only is it basically the process of understanding a question, understanding a text, you've also got to basically work out how am I going to answer it. So this is what this video is all about. And it's basically where to start looking. So if you're basically sitting there right now going, I'm absolutely stumped, I have no idea where I'm going to find the answer for this story, then this is probably some things that you need to start doing. Okay. You need to consider the following strategies. And I'll start with basically the basic strategy, which is the types of strategies that you need to start considering or start looking at are looking for basically the kinds of features of a text that you'll be asked to write about. So in English, we focus on asking the following types of questions. So we ask questions based on themes, based on techniques and structure, based on context and perspectives, based on characters and characterization, and based on modes of representation. Now, when you're looking for information, you're going to be looking for information on all of these things. And the reason for that is because those are the sorts of questions that we're going to be asking you. Now, in some cases, you might get the luxury of knowing specifically what type of question you're going to be given. However, no matter what text you're studying, or no matter what unit you're doing, you always need to take some sort sets of notes on all of these things. Now, basically, as a quick run through and a quick way of starting, themes are your main ideas of your story, of your text. Your techniques and structure is basically how it's formed and how it's put together. So language techniques, visual techniques, and so on. The context and perspectives is basically everything that surrounds it, everything that goes in and outside of it. And perspectives basically refers to who is saying what and what perspective the text has been written from. The characters and characterization is basically asking you to look at the various characters who are portrayed in the text and how they are represented. So characterization is a mode of representation. Now, in terms of modes of representation, how it's different from what I've just mentioned, is that modes of representation is how an idea or how a particular theme or idea is represented through basically a combination of all of these things. So it is a way of representing different ideas. It could be abstract ideas, it could be just a normal literal idea, which has basically been represented in a completely different and unique way. So these are the things that you need to be looking for. So for a starting point, you now basically look at where you're actually going to find your answers from and what you need to be finding answers for. Because obviously if you're going to try and interpret and understand every aspect of the text, it's going to take you forever. Whereas if you're just focusing on ideas relating to these things, then you're going to find that the process for basically being able to find your answers is much quicker, and then you can actually spend a little bit more time on really understanding what these aspects of the text are and how you're going to answer them in the response. Okay, so these are the things that you need to be really looking for. And more, and basically before anything else that you're doing, you need to be focusing on these things. All right, so let's just start with themes. Now, Why would you interpret themes or try and understand themes to start with? Well, themes are the main ideas of the text, and it will tell us about its message. Okay, so in terms of what a text is trying to communicate, that is represented by its theme. Okay, and most of the questions that you will get about a text will be related to the theme of it, as in what the text is trying to tell us and how it's trying to tell us that. Now that incorporates other aspects as well, but the main thing that you will be looking at is theme and having a deep understanding of the theme. Okay, where do you find information on theme in the text? Well, you find it in the climactic sections. In other words, you find it in basically the sections which are, I guess, the penultimate chapters of the story or of the film or whatever the text it is you're studying. It is where the story is building towards. Okay, it is the moral of the story. So when you're looking for them, you'll find basically the climactic scenes, the really big scenes, the important scenes, are the ones that are the best representatives of the theme and the ones which you'll be probably discussing anyway. So it is a very good place to basically start in terms of looking for themes of the story. And of course, the climactic sections will embody the main themes of the story, because they won't be referring to sort of subplots and subchapters. This is the main story that is being basically wrapped up in this point. So when you're looking at the climax, you really are looking at the main theme. Other tips is basically what we're going to look at when we look at other tips, just as a heads up to start with, is we're going to be looking at some other things that you could look at if you still are a bit stuck. Okay, so in this case, for themes, if you're stuck, you need to basically start looking for guides which have types of themes and list types of themes. All right, and link your text with the ones that are most compatible. Okay, so there could be a number of themes that will go with any story, and most stories could be associated with 20 or 30 themes. And that's way too many, obviously. But that's where you need to basically consider, okay, what's the most compatible one? What one represents the text the best? Okay, and then keep that, your, I guess, discussion of that theme distinct and make it sure that you define it quite clearly. So in other words, if you say it's about family, identity and change, all right, you need to choose one of those things. Because if you're trying to say it's all three of those things, then, well, first of all, you're not discussing the main idea, you're discussing the three main ideas. And second of all, you're not really going to give a very clear argument about what sort of theme's in there, and you're not going to really show that you understand the theme properly. So this is where you need to basically look. Now, this doesn't mean you go off and find study guides related to a text necessarily. You can basically just go and look up different types of themes. And there are plenty of sites out there that which will actually just list themes which occur in various types of text. And you basically look through and find one that really represents what the main idea of your story is. Okay. So techniques and structure are also another important consideration to look at when you are, first of all, inquiring about a text, and also it's one of the main things that you'll be asked to talk about. Now, composition and the construction of a text basically refer to how it's all put together and how a message is communicated to us. And you'll be discussing it using various visual and language techniques. Now, where you find these is basically, this depends according to text type. Okay, so because you'll be studying a number of different text types, such as film, such as poetry, such as plays, and such as prose, then the text types themselves have different ways of basically representing ideas and representing different themes and different storylines. So the places where you'll be looking are quite different. Basically, you need to look for details in key sections again. So key sections of the text where basically there is a lot going on. There's a lot that is visually or created through language. A lot of ideas, ideas which relate to the main theme, ideas which relate to sort of prominent features of the text. So for instance, if you're studying a film and it has, it's particularly notable for its camera angles, then you would find a scene which has a very distinctive camera angle and a distinctive use of camera angles, which is sort of represented and repeated throughout the film. And then you would basically analyze what sort of effect those cameras have. Now, if you can find something, of course, closer to the main sections of the text, so the main climactic sections, obviously you'd be looking for that. But if you can't find anything like that, then just simply go through and discuss how those different camera angles create effect, and essentially what you sort of feel when you look at things from a particular perspective. Okay, so it's about basically looking at how everything is put together. As I mentioned before, with camera angles, it's how a film is put together. It's put through the various kinds of shots that you get, and then obviously through the editing process later. But mostly the story is told through the camera picking up different scenes and putting all those things together. So it's one of those things that basically informs how messages are communicated, how stories are communicated, and how we overall basically find themes. Other tips you could look at is basically think of how a text manipulates itself to get you to think or feel in a certain way. So this is a case of working backwards, and it's something that you should always be trying to do, in which when you are basically analysing a text, start with what you get after you've read it or after you've watched it. Okay, and then think about, all right, how do I feel about that text? Do I feel horrible? Do I feel good about myself? Was it one of those really emotional endings? Was it one of those stories that just kept me on the edge of my seat the entire way through? And then think about, okay, well, how does it do that? Why does it do that? And then by looking at different parts of the text, you sort of go, oh, it jumps back and forth here, and that's what makes me feel that way. That's what makes me feel tense at this particular point in the film, or in terms of the play or book or whatever. And that's when you sort of go, well, language technique, jump cuts, quick cuts, so on. There you go, there's one theme that one language technique, one visual technique that you've got, which you then can relate to theme, you can relate to basically any kind of discussion related to that text. So basically that process of working backwards is a very valuable one, especially when you're trying to interpret something that you may not have been necessarily paying close attention to while you're actually reading it or watching it. Okay, so think of how essentially a story sucks you in, and that's the main thing that you'd be looking for. All right, context and perspectives basically inform a time, a place, and society, and how this influences a text and its meaning. So, because every text that you will be studying has been composed in the past, it's going to be referring to some aspect of the past. Now, in terms of basically the time, place, society, and culture, all those things which influence a text and its meaning, you need to think about the world around the author or the composer at the time, and think about how that would have shaped their opinions, what would have motivated them to write such a text, and particularly if you're looking at things like certain literary movements such as Romanticism or Victorianism. The time periods themselves motivated writers to write certain kinds of stories. So context and perspectives are a particularly strong indicator, especially perspective, because obviously different people have different ways of looking at the world. And certainly in terms of perspective adds a very valuable point, because it basically tells you how you should be feeling about certain things, or how a composer or author wants you to feel about a certain idea or a certain issue. Okay, so they want to create meaning through how they portray the world, and then they want you to basically interpret that portrayal, interpret that perspective that they're trying to put across to you. And this is where you basically get context and perspective informing how you look at the text, because obviously the texts that you read or watch were not made especially for you. All right, sorry to burst your bubble if you think they are, but they're not made especially for you. And if you think of something like Shakespeare, for instance, these were texts that were written for people of Shakespeare's time. They weren't meant to be studied by school students 400 years in the future. It's just to happen that way. So when you're looking at context and perspectives, they're writing for their audiences. Okay, they're not writing for you. They're not writing for future people 400 years from now. Just like if you're writing a story, you're not going to be writing a story for people 10 years, 100 years from now, because you don't know what they're going to be thinking or what perspectives they're going to have. So in terms of what a author is trying to do, they're only trying to write to people of their era. So in order to be able to understand the text, obviously, one of the first things you've got to do, understand their era, understand their perspectives, understand the way of looking at the world. You find this basically through research, and this is pretty much the only way you can find this. You need to find where the composer came from and their period of history. Those are the basic starting points. You can also look at their cultural and spiritual beliefs as well, but generally you'd be looking at those two things because they are the main things which sort of influence who we are. You may also look at their family, you may look at their education, and you may also look at their wealth, whether they came from a poorer or wealthy family, because again, all of these perspectives sort of influence how they write, how they compose their text, and what makes them want to represent things in a particular way. Now, other tips that you need to be sort of aware of is never assume knowledge about a time or place. Even similar communities had different ideas. Okay, so if you said that everyone living in a particular time was poor or destitute or hungry, well, that's never the case in any time or any place. So you can't assume knowledge about anything that may have occurred at a particular period. You need to make sure that the text is, first of all, representing a particular period in the sense that it's more representative of what it was actually like at that time. You avoid stereotypes of a particular era. So you don't just watch one film and go, oh yeah, I know everything about the 1840s now. Let me write about the story. You need to actually go into a little bit more detail, a little bit more depth, and really understand the sorts of issues and conflicts that were occurring, and particularly the events which were occurring at a period. Because the more work you do on those things, the easier it is for a text to be understood. All right, characters, basically, how they interact forms a crucial part of the story, and how they connect with audience, okay? Because we connect to characters in the story, or the characters in the story. We don't connect to any other part of the story but the people in it. Okay, we might be interested in the story because of other things in it, but we don't connect with it until we basically have some sort of engagement with the characters and the people who are involved in them. So when you're discussing those things, you need to basically look at that. Okay, you need to look at how language or visuals are deliberately chosen to represent each character. And this is how you find information on characters and characterization. For instance, if I was to say a character is portrayed as evil, then what you're basically looking for is you're looking at what sort of language and visuals represent them as an evil character. For instance, they dress in black, they brood, there's always a foreboding sense about them. All of those things represent a character. Okay, so that one is pretty much, you look for almost, you won't necessarily find stereotypes, but you will find ways that the author has tried to represent them in a way that basically shows that that character is a particular way. All right. Now, make sure that one of the things you don't do is describe the character. Okay, you're describing what role they play in the story. So you don't basically look at the visuals and language and then just start listing all the ways that they're represented. You need to discuss more of their role in the story. And the reason why you need to look more at the role in the story is because ultimately that's first of all how the story is represented through how the characters play their parts, and also how we as the audience connect with them. We don't connect with the language or the visuals so much. We connect with our basically our empathy and our sympathy going towards certain characters. And when you're asked to analyze them, you'll be asked to analyze how they are representing certain ideas and how they do, of course, connect with audiences. Because, again, that's what all storytellers are trying to do, establish a connection with audience, because that's going to keep people watching, keep people reading, and ultimately get more people reading and watching it. All right. Finally, modes of representation are basically the process of how ideas are shown to an audience. Okay, so it's a way of representing ideas. It's a way of showing things which are not necessarily tangible, things that you can see, in a way that you can see them. There are also ways of basically interpreting a text, and whether or not a text is trying to represent things in a non-literal or literal way, and what purpose, what effect those representations have. So, for instance, you will basically be looking for and asking these questions. How are characters' ideas and other aspects of the text, such as themes portrayed. Does the text use symbols, words, or emotions? Okay, so if they represent a character emotionally, and they represent them using a lot of emotional language, then what does that suggest about them? Would it suggest that they're an emotional person? Most likely, because of that language which is being used. Okay, you can represent any person in a particular way depending on the language you choose to describe them. If I was to say intelligent, articulate, and well-mannered, people will have a certain kind of image in their head, when really I could be talking about absolutely anyone. Now, when you say articulate, well-mannered, and intelligent, you'd be thinking of someone in a nice sweater and someone who's really quite intelligent up there with the world, and yet I could be describing someone who is a pro athlete, someone who is a school child, someone who is big, small, tiny, ugly, beautiful, or otherwise. Okay, all those descriptions are basically sort of connotations that we get, and yet we can use them to represent characters in different ways. So all those things, when you put them together, and I'm not, by the way, saying that professional athletes, for instance, are not any of those things. What I'm saying is that characters are represented in certain ways to create an effect, and also events are portrayed in certain ways in order to basically reflect what they should mean, what value they have, and how an audience should be viewing them. Okay, so really the question you should always be trying to ask is, what is this section trying to say? And keep asking follow-up questions. Now, this is basically an inquiry process or a process of interpretation. Now, really, when you're looking at what is this section trying to say, you're really trying to also look for deeper meanings and deeper insights into what it is trying to say. So whether that's interpreting themes, whether it's interpreting any of those other things which I've just mentioned. Okay, so techniques, context, perspectives, and also characters and characterization. So all of those things will be covered by basically you asking those questions and continuing to follow them up. Okay, so in summary, you should be looking for key sections of the text. You need to look at research, and you need to study how a story is portrayed. So just like that image there of the cute little puppy dog, we know that an image portrayed in a particular way gives us an impression, an interpretation about what this character wants. In this case of a dog, you can probably guess what this particularly cute animal is looking for. And that's the same way and the same process that you're using to basically find answers, is to look at how things are done, ask yourself a couple of questions, relate it to any of those areas such as themes, characters, techniques, context, and modes of representation, and then start to take notes, start to think about how you can construct an argument or analyze these things. And that's basically it for finding answers in a story. And until next time, I'll see you later.